I want to wait. I think we're going to see a little more action tonight than we did last time. But mostly, I just want to start with an overview, and then I have some questions for you specifically, and I'd like to make it as much of a conversation as possible. So just like we're just chatting on the phone, basically.
Right.
And etc. I'm just really glad that the holidays are over. It's my favorite time of year. They're over. I get to my desk and get so much done that it's just not even funny. It's almost worth getting through the holidays to get to January, because January is really always just a blast.
I completely don't even know that it's January yet.
Oh.
I have not adjusted to the fact that it's the second already.
Yeah.
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, I never do the New Year's. I don't bother with that.
Yeah, I don't either.
So I started watching again last night, a couple nights ago, to part 3, and I found myself really sucked in, but I couldn't finish. I wanted to watch the rooftop sequence again, but have you been watching repeated viewings? Have you been...
No, I did the one time through,
yeah,
and have just been kind of picking at little articles here and there. I'm trying not to really read too much before I watch it again.
Yeah.
Although I did listen to a few of the tapes today, kind of in preparation for this, just because there are a couple of questions I had about things.
Yeah.
One is the day where they're kind of sitting there and John doesn't show up, and Paul says, and then there were two, and it's very cleverly edited in the film.
Yeah.
To make it seem like he's just sitting there staring into space. And on the tape, though, there's a comment immediately afterward from Ringo where he says Tom and Jerry.
Yeah.
And Michael says Simon and Garfunkel, and there's a little back and forth, a little exchange. Which, I think as we look at this, as people begin to go over this and compare it to the tapes and whatever footage had already been out there, I think there are going to be some questions that come up about how much. I hate to use the word manipulated.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's the right word, but how much Peter Jackson shaped the narrative.
Right.
In a certain direction to tell a certain story, and maybe that story is still largely accurate,
right?
But with little nuances that may be fudging things a little bit, maybe kind of glossing over certain things.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that for certain. I'm just saying it's a thing that's kind of floating around. An idea that's floating around in my head, and I don't know the answer to that yet.
Right. Right. And there was actually a tweet about that from They Shall Not Be Parted, the guy who's doing all the Niagara reels.
Oh yeah.
Like second by second. Have you heard that?
Right. I know of that. That there's a blog, right?
So I dipped into the podcast a little bit before the film drop just to sort of brush up, and it is painstaking. I think you'll really like it because it's very in detail.
I like pain.
Yes.
So.
And he plays parts of it. He'll play 5 or 6 minutes, and then he'll say, and so this is what they were talking about, and we think this refers to this and this, and he gives you all this deep commentary. I mean, and it's really didactic in the best possible way. If you're into this stuff, it's kind of it's microscopic in the way that, like, the more you look at it, the deeper you want to go. It's all of that.
Right.
It's all of that.
Yeah.
And I think in the main, I'm with you. I trust Peter Jackson for a lot of these decisions. I do think that there is some editorializing going on that begs the question of manipulation. And but I think there's good manipulation and bad manipulation, obviously. And I'm just really curious what do you see as like some of the standout threads for? You just named one. Are there others that you think, this we really need to investigate this?
I mean, there's that weird fine line around the subject of Yoko, around the same time they're having this conversation about, and then there were two. This whole thing about the meeting of the day before and how Yoko was speaking for John and how this is disruptive and it's frustrating. Linda actually has a good take on this in that conversation, which we don't really get all of in the film.
Right.
But you hear it on the tapes, and and it's funny. Paul is both pointing out that there's a problem, but he's also kind of defending their relationship.
Right.
And he's really, I think he seems more concerned that John is not speaking up, and he's letting Yoko speak for him, and it's that John seems disengaged.
Right.
And that that may very well be the heroin issue, and not specifically. They're tiptoeing around blaming Yoko specifically.
Right.
I don't think anybody is really flat out going like it's all her fault, but they realize there's some tension, and he's not engaging, and that seems to be Paul's greatest frustration.
Right. That is very revealing footage, and I read that back when the Get Back book came out, and they transcribed all that tape, and we sort of know. I think that Paul's stock goes up with Peter Jackson because he does seem very sympathetic to that relationship, but it's still. Again, what's missing from all of this great footage is this lack of context, right? You don't have people saying, so we get to see the Beatles' immediate reaction to this, but was this typical? The way they're reacting to it, it seems like maybe the very first time he had taken Yoko to a meeting and made her do all the talking, or it wasn't the first time she's at a Beatle meeting, but they're acting like it's like, I really want more context. Like, I want to know, right, whether this is the third time. To me, it's always striking how much Lennon got away with by positioning her as his shield and using her to convey, like, I really don't want to participate anymore, but I just don't have the nerve to say so until late in September 1969. And I think there's a tremendous ambivalence there, and you can see that they're still working together. They still have really great sessions sometimes, but that he's got a growing ambivalence about it. I think Yoko's stop goes up too in this Peter Jackson film because she seems so harmless. She just seems like, I'm just sitting here hanging out, like I'm not, And so I think it's in a very interesting way. Everyone's stock goes up except for Lennon's, because Lennon is clearly like strung out in a couple scenes and like really ambivalent and like, not a full-fledged participant. And it's like, it's hard to imagine almost any other sessions at any other Beatles album where Lennon would be like so inactive, so passive. He's just not a passive character.
Yeah, I read something recently, maybe it was today, where somebody was talking about how George is coming in with one new song after another.
Right.
And John is just not producing at this point. And is there some resentment there? Another thread that we need to look at is the tension between John and George. It's sort of painted that Paul is the bad guy and George walking out, but the contemporary reports, there's no fist fight. There's no bust up. That was sort of the rumor mill in the papers at the time. But George is interviewed, and he says that they had a falling out.
Right.
With John, not with Paul, with John.
Right.
So that's really kind of glossed over in this documentary, maybe because there's no way to answer that on film.
Right.
And or audio. So, we also have to kind of think about, he's working with the material he's got. He's got to make a film, not a radio play. And so how does he handle that? How does he construct a narrative out of the footage that he has? So, there's a lot that's sort of happening off stage. And I mean, I think the commentary has to be external. I don't think it can be in the documentary. I think it's the kind of thing that's going to be generated by, lunatics like us who go through all this stuff with a fine-tooth comb and try to compare notes and look at contemporaneous interviews and get a sense of what was happening around this.
Yeah. Concerning George and Lennon, I mean, my takeaway, tell me if I'm really curious to hear your feedback on whether you think I've got this right or not. But my sense is in part one, Lennon is more than ambivalent towards George. He's really kind of like ignoring him and like not participating. And George's body language is very like he doesn't really want to be there either. And then finally, when he brings around I Me Mine, Lennon just stands there and berates him and says, "This is a rock and roll band, son. You can't be bringing around this stupid shit." And it's very... He's being jocular about it as though, I know I can rib George this way. We're close buddies. But it's also just really rude. And, nobody would ever do that to Lennon bringing in a new song, right?
Right.
And then they have that meeting. And then there's a second meeting. And then in later parts 2 and 3, Lennon is expressly and demonstrably supportive of Harrison.
Right.
And I think he kind of shifts gears, and that's why I really wish we had more of that cafeteria conversation, because we get 6 minutes, and Lennon sort of says, "Yeah, it's been a festering wound, and it's gone too far," and he knows, he's very clear, he's very self-conscious about, we're kind of egomaniacs, and we crowd this guy out, and he's starting to show up with material, and we need to do better. And then the rest of the movie, he actually shows George a ton of support. So I want to make sure we make time for George's song in this session. And George has a long talk with him about, I just got tons of material. I just am going to go do a big project because, I've got too much now. I can't keep bringing it all in. It's not going to work with this band. And Lennon's like, yeah, you should definitely do that. So I think Lennon kind of changes gears there in a very dramatic way. I mean, it's the one upside to Lennon that you get with all the other stuff.
No, I think you're right. He realizes what's going on with George, and I mean that cafeteria conversation is I need to watch that again and again.
Yes, and that's one of the most frustrating things for me is if there's 25 minutes of that. God, I hope he leaks that.
Yeah, it's just amazing and so revealing of their dynamic with each other,
right,
and how they would speak in unguarded fashion. About their leadership,
right,
about their position, the sort of power dynamic,
right,
within this band. The thing about George, which I'm still kind of, even after, so I spent a year and a half reading and every interview I could get on him contemporaneously and then after the Beatles and everything, and just trying to get a sense of his story in this when we were writing All Things Must Pass Away. And George in 1969, even early 1970, is in a much different place mentally and emotionally about the Beatles than he would be after that.
Mm-hmm.
He's looking for a way of continuing this band. He realizes what they mean to everybody, and he spent so much time in this. Remember, he's only 27 in 1970, so he spent his young adulthood in this band, and so like the rest of them, it's probably very difficult to imagine a life outside of the Beatles.
Right.
And so in 69, he's thinking, sort of referring to his comments in early 1970, where he's like, "We'll get back together. They're just being bitchy to each other.
Right.
I think it would be selfish if the Beatles don't record together. They mean so much to each other. I would certainly do it." All of these very positive comments, which I think are, I have to assume they're consistent unless somebody can find some quotes that say otherwise.
Right.
This is kind of how he's thinking in January 69 of like, we need to get on with this. And this whole thing of like, I'll just record an album of my own songs is kind of a way of saying like, and he says this in early 1970, I'm just going to record an album to get rid of a bunch of songs because his main priority is the Beatles. So it's like a side project like Wonderwall,
right,
or Electronic Sounds, where he's like, I'll get this out of the way, and I'll get to do my thing and have my say the way I want to have
right,
it.
right. Well,
But and so I think that's his perspective at that time when he's talking to John about that, and John is very supportive. There's no sense of like we're going to break up
right,
at this point.
right.
So his arc, to me, his arc is very interesting from middle period Beatles to the end, and then just beyond. He as a human being, as a character in this story, really develops dramatically. And I don't think we've given that perspective enough credit, enough time.
Well, and it's a very curious arc that keeps going, obviously, after the Beatles and through his solo career, and then after he dies. George's stock just keeps exploding. I mean, we look at George very differently now than we did when it was happening, because he really was upstaged by these two peers, and he was the kid brother figure. But it's hard to remember that he actually had done a big solo project already. Right? And he was like the first Beatle to do a solo album. But he's kind of acting like he'd never done it. It's weird. Like you wouldn't know it unless you studied this stuff. The other thing I think that happened, I agree with all of that. The other thing I think that casts a huge shadow over all this material is the Rolling Stone interviews that John Lennon gives. Is it at the end of? It's at the end of 1970. It says Plastic Ono Band comes out, and he says things like, I don't even have to check with George. I know that he was tired of being a sideman for Paul. We all were, and I think that when John vents his spleen like that, it really colored the way they all looked at it. Even though, it's clear now that was just the space Lennon was in at the time, and it's taken us a long time to figure out, okay, this loose cannon really, he speaks in vast exaggerations, and you have to parse everything he says, because within a couple months he's on the phone with Paul. He's it's like he's really very in the moment. He vents his spleen, and then the next day he's on the phone having a great conversation with the person that he just ripped apart the day before. And McCartney has a special talent for kind of like just going along with this. Like he really, and I dipped into his book the other night. Oh my God, this book. Have you looked at the lyrics book by McCartney?
No, I keep hearing about it, but I haven't.
Well, Grill Marcus just called the book humble, which just I just don't. I think that's just a miss. I think that's a misfire. I mean, I think if it was one volume, you could call it humble, but with two volumes,
humble doesn't come to mind for a number of reasons.
It reminds me of that what Pauline Kael said about Ronaldo and Clara when Dylan says, "I want to be buried anonymously inside a tree," and she said, "Yeah, that's why I made a 3-hour epic about my last tour." Anyway, but Paul again in this, he says that Lennon wrote "How Do You Sleep," and he goes into I was writing "Dear Friend" and how painful that was, and it was really like, are you really saying that I'm a crappy songwriter? Is that, and he says, and that was John. That was really the way John, you had to let John spin his wheels like that. McCartney seems to have enough of an ego to partner up with this guy Lennon, who he knows is just going to be popping off all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that we have had to come to terms with over the years. I think we're just getting to the point where we're like, yeah, Lennon shot his mouth off a lot.
A lot.
It was not gospel. He was speaking for himself in that moment,
right,
as you say, and not for the other band members. And his opinion was so vocal and so certain that I think he colored, at least for the 70s and 80s, he colored people's opinions about the end of the Beatles throughout that entire time. I mean, it was very much like he's planting his flag, and everybody went, "Yep, well, okay, John says so, so
right,
we're going to agree with that."
Right.
And you read through the articles in the literature, and it's just like they're falling in line behind what he has to say, and yeah, there's a lot to sort through there. It's difficult. It's really difficult to take his perspective on that stuff, and make sense out of it.
Yeah, and he's also just really rude. Like I think the Rolling Stone interviews Lennon just like burning bridge after bridge after bridge, right?
Right.
And the Beatles are basically, he knows that he has strong enough bonds with the Beatles, and I can say anything and I can still record with these guys. They know me. But, he says they ask him how he likes Ringo's album, and he said, well, it didn't embarrass me, and just, it's just like, that's just so rude. Like, Ringo, I mean, those Ringo's records really hold up. And at the same time, Lennon is very frustrated that McCartney steals all the thunder for claiming I'm leaving the band, and he's using it to sell a record. He's just like, oh, this guy is just really good at marketing. He always has been. Some of you can never dismiss Lennon out of hand. Some of it is just too true. Some of it's just wildly exaggerated. But I do think that that interview kind of cast a big shadow over all of this material and the way the Beatles themselves thought about it, because their own quotes about Let It Be, and even Lennon characterizing all these sessions as just painfully bad, terrible, god-awful, the worst sessions ever. It's clear that on film they're not. It's clear that they misremembered these sessions.
And I wonder, how much in their own memories, including George Martin, because he's looking back at this and saying it was a terrible experience, how much they are engaging with John's memory of it.
Right.
Because it's so persistent. And the fact that Rolling Stone, Jan Winter put out that book absolutely against John's wishes, which I learned just recently ended their relationship. John never spoke to him again after that.
Right. To Winter.
To Winter, right. And so that made that interview...
Right, the official record, right?
The official record,
right.
And it made it very accessible because he put it in a book form.
Right.
And, anybody could order a copy of that at that point. And so, that became really the dominant narrative for the end of the Beatles. And, it just didn't give any context to say, at no point did anybody come out and say, okay, well, this is John in the very delicate period. There was no new introduction to the book that said, okay, John might have been going through some things here. None of that. It was just put it out and let the interview speak for itself, which, it has cast a huge shadow. So that's I wonder, like I said, I wonder how much they are engaging with that interview, those memories, and rather than sort of thinking about what their own memories of those sessions are.
Right. So what else? I want to make sure that we save time to talk about the rooftop sequence, because when I wrote up my piece for Copper Magazine, I didn't write a lot about the rooftop, and I actually think it's like the greatest payoff in any movie sequence of all time. It's just, but a bit more about some of these other sessions. So what are some of the other frustrating moments you have with the way Peter Jackson framed some of this? I'm frustrated by some of the footage that he uses as B-roll over some audio where he doesn't have them talking, and you can tell that he's cheating like crazy.
He has to.
He has to, right?
He doesn't have the footage. Sometimes this happened a lot, and I actually brought it up on the Hoffman forum. There's this guy who's does a lot of video work, who frequents there. He's really done a lot of work in the industry in the past 35, 40 years. And I brought that up, and I said, there are times where the lip sync is clearly off, and they're fudging it. You can tell. And to me, it's distracting because I notice stuff like that.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of people notice stuff like that. And he said, this is what you're going to have to do in documentaries where you just don't have all the footage. So I don't think he's necessarily playing unfair in doing that. I think he's putting together the best visual document of this that he can.
Yeah.
But it is frustrating. It is. I'm second guessing him. And I have no right to do that because I just don't know what the material is. But I just kind of feel like, is there a better way of, is there a less distracting way of presenting this? I don't know.
Right. I think so. This is this fits into my larger take, which is the target audience for this material really is other musicians.
Yeah.
People who have worked in bands, who understand how sluggish the process can be and how you're juggling a lot of different psychological issues and, people's marriages come into play and all of that stuff's off screen, but you have to deal with it in a band. And so when he does stuff like that, it really, for musicians, it takes us out of the story a little bit, because we're noticing, wait a second, that's not the guitar line that I'm hearing. He's doing a close up of the bass part there, but the bass is not taking a solo there. And because it's such a musicianly piece, it does kind of betray the fact that Peter Jackson is not a musician.
Yeah.
So those are moments that I feel a little bit. I'm also very curious, and I don't know I think I asked you about this before, but do you know how well the time syncs up on the rooftop sequence between, when the cops show up? Is he using a master clock to sync up all that stuff, or is he cutting that to sort of build suspense and, the cops don't get to the roof till a certain point, and he's timing it with all those on the street interviews to build momentum in the sequence?
I don't know exactly, but I do have to say that is a brilliantly handled sequence.
It is it is so brilliant. Yeah.
He absolutely builds tension in that sequence where there needs to be, and I think even if he's fudged the timeline a tiny bit, it's negligible. I mean, in listening to the tapes, just having the tapes over the years and listening, you don't get that sense of drama building.
Right.
And that there's this is moving towards something. So yeah, I mean, I didn't get a sense watching it that something was off, which could just be his brilliance in editing,
right.
Brilliance in putting this together.
Right.
Maybe somebody has put it all together and said, okay, this doesn't line up, but I mean, I don't think that's being untrue to the spirit of what's happening.
Oh, I don't either.
That's just good filmmaking.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'm just really curious how well it lines up. I just love to see someone do the lineup and say, well, he cheats a little bit here, but yeah, totally. I'm not against cheating. I mean,
Yeah.
And the other adorable thing about that sequence is that the cops are so young. They're like, oh my God, that's a 15-year-old kid who's trying to arrest the Beatles. Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's just so hilarious.
The one guy just seems like he's out to sea, doesn't he? He's just like, oh, well, you have to tell them to be quiet.
I mean, it's really unfair, because he will go down in history as the guy who ordered Mal to unplug the...
Right.
Now, do you know of any Mal Evans quotes where he's interviewed about, he felt like he needed to unplug him to appease the cops? Because what's clear from the sequence that we have now, and what I always suspected, was that the Beatles he knows it's their last number. He knows the set list. He's trying to tell the cops, this is it. It's only 3 more minutes. Just hang in there. It's not a big deal. But then he does go ahead and unplug these 2 guitar amps.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit like, whoa, whoa, that's John Lennon's guitar amp.
Yeah. I haven't seen any quotes. Maybe, Ken Womack has all of his diaries and stuff now, so he's,
Oh, that's right. That's right. I just read that. Yeah, Ken's going to do that.
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I haven't read anything, from any articles, any pieces. Maybe there's something out there, but that tells me that Mal is feeling intense pressure from this guy.
Intense pressure, right? It tells you a lot about Mal, because his whole job is, it's like a cliche. He's like the production assistant of all production assistants. They ask for an anvil, and he shows up with an anvil. I mean, it's crazy. It's
such a hilarious moment that he actually does it.
And it's just like unbelievable. It's like, yep, the Beatles have this guy who anything they ask for, boom, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's just colossal. But he must feel very threatened by the cops. But then there's all this stuff from Ringo in the anthology about, we thought it would be really fun if the cops hauled us off at the end to make a great ending to the movie.
Right. I mean, just the shot of Paul when he turns around and he sees the cops coming through the door, and he turns back toward the camera, and the look on his face is just pure joy.
Yes.
He's like, here we go.
Yeah. Yes.
What we talked about earlier is going to happen. He's so excited. I mean, that moment alone is worth everything.
It's a wonderful moment. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So, what do you see as like promising new areas of research that we haven't covered yet?
Oh God. I still haven't made sense of all of it. I mean, that's the crazy